Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches, where today I'm going to be talking about the Mythica films released between 2015 and 2016. They were a quintet of fantasy adventures that formed a single complete narrative, while still ostensibly, though not with equal levels of success, being satisfying standalone offerings in and of themselves. And the first film begins with black-clad evildoers raiding the temple of the goddess. They kill the temple guards and then make off, taking most of the priestesses with them as their prisoners. An intrepid band of heroes are needed to pursue them and rescue the captives. Alas, intrepid heroic types prove thin on the ground. The only ones willing to take on the task, for varying definitions of willing, are our main characters, the most central of whom is Marek, a runaway slave with a club foot but a sharp mind. She's picked up some magical skill from a local wizard, and she also demonstrates an inborn necromantic talent, very similar to the sorcery used by the villains. This is, of course, a major plot point later in the series. Joining Marek are Tila, the only priestess to escape the attack on the temple, Thane, a world weary but honourable warrior, and Dagon, a charming rogue, quote unquote. If you've done much gaming, particularly tabletop gaming, you've probably already thinking, "Wow, that sounds like an archetypical D&D party, Dungeons and Dragons party. There's a fighter, a wizard, a rogue, and a cleric." And I don't think that's an accident. For one thing, Matthew Mercer is in this, and he makes a big chunk of his income from running a D&D live play. Beyond that, the films feature several obvious callbacks to role-playing games, and they're obvious ones. Heck, the first film has a tavern where the adventurers go to find quests. Of course, the mission to rescue the captive priestesses can't sustain 5 movies, so it turns out to only be the first step in a much more vast and pressing quest. The black-clad raiders are servants of Zorlok, a wicked necromancer who aspires to claim the mantle of the ancient Lich King, a power that would allow him to challenge the very gods themselves. Can Marek and her ragtag bunch of allies really hope to stand in his way? So these 5 films were partly financed through Kickstarter, which is how I became aware of them. Each movie's funding goal of around 75,000 US dollars, which is about $100,000 in today's terms, was only part of the total production costs, much of which were being funded in other ways. But it still gives you a clear indication that these were being produced on limited resources. If $100,000 makes a difference to your movie, you're definitely not playing in the big studio stakes. Now, at the time, the Kickstarters heavily emphasized the involvement of Kevin Sorbo, former star of the late 90s action fantasy series Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, and modern day racist, misogynistic, homophobic jerk. Hopefully, if they were kickstarting today, they wouldn't cast him at all. Fortunately, Sorbo's actual on screen role in the films is fairly limited. Playing a far more significant on screen role is Matthew Mercer of Critical Role fame. If you don't know who Critical Role are, they're behind the Amazon Prime animated show The Legend of Vox Machina, which, to give you a comparison to these films, raised $11 million when it launched on Kickstarter. So, somewhat different financial footing. So there is actually a sixth Mythica film, I think I should mention this, called Stormbound. It came out last year. It again features Mercer, though not, I'm pleased to say, Sorbo. I've not seen it yet, so I'm not discussing it in this video. And also, the first 5 films do form a single complete narrative, so they make sense to consider as a unit. So why don't we start doing exactly that? And the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that these films do punch above their weight in quality to budget sense. While producers Aristorm Entertainment are clearly a long way from the big end of town, they spend their money wisely. First up, the mistake of Kevin Sorbo aside, they've assembled a talented cast who do good work. Melanie Stone is excellent as Marek, who stands out among the 4 protagonists as our most central character and is therefore a vital linchpin role. Which is not to suggest that any of the other 3 let the side down, mind you. They all deliver solid performances, and I think the on screen chemistry between Thane and Tila is excellent. Now, these were far from being Aerostorm's first fantasy movies. Their production team had clearly built up quite a good store of supplies and techniques from their earlier projects. The costumes and sets are equally solid with the acting. The CGI effects are a little bit more of a mixed bag. Most are pretty solid for the era these were released, especially for lower budget fare. But there are some moments where the filmmakers' ambitions probably outreach their capabilities. Some larger scale action and effect sequences don't come off quite as well as I would have liked. Still, I don't think it's a major blemish. I'm willing to take a little bit of, um, you know, shonky CGI if everything else is being done well. And Aristorm have spent their money wisely on what ends up on the screen. The result of movies that look and feel bigger than they were budget-wise, even if I mean, they're not going to compete with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films for their scale. Now, there's an old adage about the Star Trek movies that the even numbered ones are the good ones. I don't personally agree with it. I'd rather watch one or three than four, and I don't think five is as bad as some people make out. But the concept is relevant because the reverse applies here. The weak points in this five film series are, in my opinion, the even numbered entries. The biggest problem is that the fourth film, and to a lesser extent the second, feels very much like an episode in the series rather than a complete movie in itself. The odd numbered mythical films do a pretty good job of telling a story that feels complete and whole in and of themselves, even while forming a part of a larger arc. That is not so much the case in The Dark Spore and the Iron Crown. It's not impossible to make a movie that's clearly part of a bigger story and still have it be good. Many would argue that The Empire Strikes Back does just that, but with the Iron Crown in particular, I don't feel that that's the case here. The second and fourth films have other issues too. Both struggle with pacing. Dark Spore, because it does so much recapping of the first film and then exposition to set up the rest of the series. And The Iron Crown, because it's basically one long combination chase slash fight scene. Now, that's something that can work. Mad Max Fury Road is a really good film and it does exactly that. But it's a tough task to give plot points enough time to sink in when you're throwing a new stunt sequences at us every 3 or 4 minutes. The fourth Mythica movie doesn't quite manage the balancing act, which means that dramatic moments lose some of their impact, and there are times where there's a real sense of tone whiplash as we go rapidly from something grim to a fight scene with banter, or vice versa. The Iron Crown is also a little bit wonky on the world building front. It has a major steampunk element that was entirely absent from the previous three films and doesn't really feature in the last one. And finally, it has a predatory lesbian villain, which, given that it's the franchise's only real acknowledgement of non-hetero relationships, is a bit on the nose when your only non-hetero character is a predatory lesbian. It's not a great look. But for me personally, there's really one key metric of success for a fantasy adventure film or TV show for that matter. Does it make me want to play Dungeons and Dragons? Because if it does, it's succeeding. And on that front, the Mythica movies emphatically get a passing grade from me. I'm not going to pretend that they don't have flaws. I just spent a decent amount of this video describing some of them, but they absolutely spark the urge in me to do some tabletop gaming. Technically not actually D&D itself anymore. I prefer other systems to the current edition of the world's most famous role-playing game, but it makes me want to game, and that's what's important. A big part of the film's success on this front is that they land their central character arcs. For instance, Merrick, who has, as I noted, the series' most central character, enters the series as a runaway slave frightened of her own power and must gradually step up to become the leader in the final last-ditch effort to defeat the seemingly unstoppable Zorlok. The series does a good job of making you want to see Merrick get her big moment where she finally throws down with the bad guy. Now, of course, some of the kudos for that success has to go to Melanie Stone's fine performance in the role, but the arc has to be well executed in the first place. It has to be in a solid form in order for her to depict it, and the films do deliver on that challenge. So, yeah, if you're a fan of fantasy media, particularly if you're a tabletop gamer and you're willing to dabble in something outside of prestige big budget fare like a Game of Thrones or Rings of Power, I suggest you give the Mythica films a try. Next time, I actually had some nice things to say about the micro budget hokum that was The Killer Shrews. I will not be so kind to its sibling production, the 1959 Monster Mash Giant Gila Monster. But that is next time. Until then, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've seen the Mythic films, let me know what you thought of them.